This is Dateline News and Conversation. The topic tonight, the threat of nuclear war. I don't know that it's ever been as great and dangerous as it is now, with French President Macron basically wanting to send troops into Ukraine to kill Russians. My guest tonight, he's a good friend, Stanislav Kraprivnik. Stas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
It's always my pleasure. Let's start out. I want to talk about two things tonight. This gaslighting that's going on about nuclear war. It's all over the news. And then I want to talk to you about the presidential election, which begins tomorrow and ends on Sunday. But let's begin with this threat of nuclear war. How much of an existential, real threat do you think this is, with Macron wanting to go in with Poland and the coalition of the willing? We've heard that before. How serious do you think this is? Putin has said it again very clearly and emphatically. If Russia is attacked, Crimea, any of the other new republics, Russia will use nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts about it? Do you think it's real?
Honestly, I don't think nukes will get used unless it's an absolute. If the West uses first strike, then of course they're going to get a second retaliatory strike. One second. Sorry about that. Can we start over that little piece that I did? I want to close the window just for.
We're live. We're live.
Okay, yeah, sorry. All right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start over. Actually, I don't think the threat is that big for actual nuclear use, unless, of course, the West does a tactical nuke or something of that sort. And the reason I go off that is the theory that weapons of mass destruction become political weapons the moment both sides have them. Yes, America used atom bombs on Japan. Japan didn't have any response back. However, if you look at World War II, gas weapons were never used, except for two instances. The Japanese used it in two battles in Burma. They gave their soldiers glass gas grenades with the purpose of shooting the commander of the British tank and throwing the gas grenade into the tank to kill the crew. And it worked splendidly. The problem is Tokyo started thinking about that. Like, wait a minute. If word gets out that we're using gas, it's over. Because the problem is, at that point, was that every side had an air division or more with gas bombs ready to go. Right? So Hitler, to the very end, never gave the order. None of the high command in Germany gave the order to drop gas bombs on Russian cities because they knew it would come right back to them. And gas bombs on for example, mustard gas, nerve gas on top of a major city is basically the same effect as having a nuclear explosion, minus the actual explosion. The population will be destroyed. There's no surviving. Sure, gas weapons were used on the front lines of World War I, but that was A, because it was a novel weapon, B, because the reach was relatively localized. This wasn't a weapon that could reach cities at that point. So it was a battlefield weapon. Nuclear weapons are not battlefield weapons. Gas weapons, and when you're coming down to gas-laden bombs that are air delivered, are not battlefield weapons. They become strategic weapons. The moment both sides have strategic weapons, the chances of them actually being used decreases exponentially, because that's it. Once you've used them, that's it. And both sides quite well understand it. Not to say that it might not happen, of course, but I think the chances are relatively low. Plus, honestly speaking, we would beat NATO regardless of where the battlefield. Sure, it'll be a hard war. But NATO, especially in its present circumstances, cannot win a war against Russia. Let's not also forget that Russia has a reserve of veterans. Well, veterans in this case, okay, people who have had military service. Some of those are veterans of different wars. Some are just military service, prior military service. But it has a reserve of 30 million men. They can be and will be activated, of course. So that's an overwhelming military force. Most of NATO is very heavily degraded. Americans are out of shape, and the British are too, if we're going to speak reality. You know, the U.S. Army last year reached a new milestone, 20% obesity rate. The previous year was 16% obesity rate. You know, when I served, I would be surprised if it was a 1% obesity rate. Pretty damn sure it wasn't even close to that. So you already see the degradation of the military combat capabilities of most Western countries. Sure, their units are very combat capable, but they are not the majority of the military. The French, more likely there's going to be a big war, and the clouds seem to be gathering for it. But the French only have 30 to 40,000 troops, combat capable troops they can send. And the Czechs are now behind us too, and the Poles are behind it, and the pre-Baltic three midgets are behind it. But the pre-Baltic three midgets can muster up about 12,000 troops overall. And then the Poles have about 200,000, and big question how much the Czechs actually have, even with reserves.
All right, Stas, do you actually think that if there is a next war, it'll be a traditional World War II ground-based war between thousands of troops? Do you really think that's what will happen? I mean, if Macron and the coalition of the willing send, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 troops to Ukraine, what is going to be their goal? Is their goal going to be to overrun Crimea, to take back Crimea? As Zelensky has said, we're going to take it back. Zaporozhye, Kherson. What kind of a war do you think is realistic?
Well, first of all, Dragon 2024, which is under the umbrella of Steadfast Defender 2024, has just concluded today. As a matter of fact, today is the 14th. That means there are about 90,000 troops, NATO troops, on the Polish-Ukrainian border, about 1,200 pieces of heavy machinery. So you're talking tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, wheeled fighting vehicles, and so on. They got a pretty big task force already. It won't be 10, 20,000. Anything they send in is going to be in the 100,000. 100,000 or more, especially if the French throw in their lot. Now, in that 90,000 or 2.5, they were participating 2.5 Polish divisions, one tank division, one Pomeranian mechanized infantry division, plus some other units. There is about 20,000 English, about 7,000 Germans, an unconfirmed number of Americans, but it's not just 82nd Airborne that's in that area and 6th Cav. There were also units that were reserve units that were brought in from the state, from stateside. So there's a force there already. Plus, behind that is still another 200,000 Polish troops on the area. Now, inside of Ukraine are already probably somewhere around 10, 12,000, maybe 20,000 mercenaries. Now, amongst those are actual mercs. Amongst those are ideological fighters. But a very large percentage of those mercenaries are American or British combat soldiers or specialists. There are mercenaries. Why I say that over and over again is because they are American contract soldiers that sign a contract with something like Blackwater, and it gets sent over there with a cover that they're mercenaries. Really, they're still American soldiers. That's why suddenly you had 10,000 Poles quit the army. They never quit the army. They got sent in to get combat experience. So 3,000 of those guys got so much combat experience, they're now rotting in the graves. 2,000 Finns just quit the Finnish army. I understand that Finland's sending basically a brigade down to get combat experience. So we're already fighting and killing NATO troops. I mean, it's that easy, simple. Those 2 Patriot systems that got blown up, there's about 30 Brits that went to see their maker. The HIMARS systems that are being destroyed are manned by Americans. So let me put this out completely straight. Americans make the missiles that the HIMARS systems use. Americans deliver the missiles that the HIMARS systems use. Americans man the HIMARS systems. Americans who man the HIMARS systems are firing the missiles and the HIMARS. American tracking and satellite systems bring those missiles on target. This is the U.S. Army firing from the start to the very end against Russian military and civilian targets. And we're already fighting NATO. It's just not declared, and it's not large NATO units. Now, NATO barging in into Russia, we see this as one of 3 scenarios. The most aggressive scenario is NATO is going to take up initially at least, a defensive role up and down the Dnieper River to block any Russian movements further. And then with the concept of forcing Russia to negotiations and dictating terms to Russia, which is insanely idiotic. But I think NATO leadership's convinced themselves once NATO shows up in strength, or anything that resembles strength for them at this present point, the Russian government and the Russian leadership is going to buckle and fall on their knees and beg for mercy and to take whatever suicidal terms that NATO decides to deliver. It's fantasy. It's copium in massive doses. A less adventurous position is NATO will block passages or movement routes to Odessa, because once Odessa's taken, that's it. Ukraine is a landlocked territory. And the least offensive option is NATO takes up position along the southern Belarus border, freeing up about 100,000 Ukrainian troops that can now be, at their joy of being turned into meat, get sent down to the front, and Zelensky gets his fantasy of a new offensive. Again, that's what it's looking like right now. Which choice they'll take, or a choice of not to take, we'll have to live and see. But that's what it's kind of looking like right now.
Yeah. One of our viewers, Richard Dillman, is asking, do you know, Stas, if there are any partisan fighters in Ukraine that can stand up to Nazi Zionists? So are there any partisans, either Russian or Ukrainian, that are involved in what's going on in Ukraine?
Well, I don't know if they'll be fighting Zionists. That'd have to go a bit further south for that. But there are partisans active, especially in places like the Odessa Oblast. There have been 3 supply trains have been derailed. There's been running attacks on Ukrainian units. So there are partisans, and when I mean derailed, they were also exploded. So there are ordnance trains, ordnance troops, equipment being moved toward the front from NATO countries. So there are active partisan units in those areas that are ethnically Russian. So that's Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, Konotop, those areas, and probably even in Kiev, Kharkov region. So in all these areas, there are Russian partisans, because there's Russian ethnic people living there. They're the majority, even if a lot of them have been brainwashed over the last 10, 20, 30 years.
Last night, we were returning from Simferopol in a taxi, and the driver was a former Russian military officer who, I guess, during Soviet time fought in Afghanistan, and he said he was also in Syria. I don't know how much there was to believe, but he said he and a number of others would go to the Kherson region and other regions of Russian-held territory, and with their hunting rifles were shooting down drones. He said it was the most effective weapon to shoot down drones. Now, these would be Russian partisan type fighters. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, first I want to correct you. Those aren't Russian-held territories. Those are now part of Russia. Those are part of the federal whole of Russia. So, and that's what NATO doesn't seem to understand. NATO's gotten itself into this concept that Vladimir Vladimirovich is a dictator who can do whatever he wants. So fine, we'll make a deal with him, and he gives up these portions, and then maybe keeps a little here, and he'll just go explain it to the people. Well, he can't. I mean, it's the most ludicrous crap that they can understand. That there is a constitution. The Constitution forbids the separation of any federal territories to any other national entity. So no, he cannot give away Russian lands. Russian lands have voted overwhelmingly to be part of Russia. In fact, he is constitutionally bound to retrieve any and all territory that is now occupied at present by Ukraine or NATO. So Kherson City, Zaporozhye City, and all those territories have to be cleared. And there's going to be no peace deal until they're cleared. So that's how that runs. Now, the more the Ukrainians shell, the further distance, and the further it's going to have to be a buffer zone. Then the problem becomes is those buffer zones like Kharkov are going to become Kharkov Oblast of Russia because there's a majority Russian population there. And then if they keep shelling those areas now, those areas have to be protected and the enemy has to be pushed back. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if NATO doesn't decide to go, I don't know, have some common sense. Now, as far as shooting drones with rifles, that's not unheard of. Sniper rifles are very effective. It depends what kind of drone you're shooting. Now, if you're shooting down, there are different roles for different drones. If you're dealing with FVP drones, the chances of shooting them down are pretty small. They're very fast, they're small, they're relatively quiet. If you're dealing with large drones that are dropping grenades, not just small grenades, but actual large, tubular grenades, you got a good chance, especially things like Baba Yaga. It's a pretty damn big drone. It's 4 meters across from end to end, or 3 meters. So, I mean, it's a pretty big, fat target. And they're also often used as signal relay points, so to extend the range of the other drones. So they're pretty stationary, too. And of course, yeah, you can shoot them down with a sniper rifle. It's done all over the field.
All right, let me pursue this a little bit further. If NATO were to attack any of these regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, the regions that have rejoined Russia, would that trigger a direct Russian response, such as a nuclear response? Or what would be Russia's response in a case like that? It's the Russian mainland now.
Well, it'd be a declaration of war. We'll begin with that. Whether or not NATO thinks it won't be a declaration of war, it will be a declaration of war. If it becomes a declaration of war, it's not going to stay in Ukraine. You're instantly, the entire globe becomes a battlefield, which means bases in Poland, in Germany, in France, in Czech, and pre-Baltics are all going to be coming under fire. If that's the case, then the first thing that Russia has to do is shorten its border and secure its northwestern flank, which would mean the the 3 pre-Baltic republics are going to get overrun real quick, because that area has to be secured, close the ports and the flank, and then you get a straightened out border. And then, of course, by that point, NATO is going to have to be attacking Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is that knife in the ribs. And why? Because Iskander missiles that are stationed in Kaliningrad can reach any logistical point in Northern Europe, which means any depots, any tactical or strategic transfer points, they're all going to be coming under rocket fire. These are non-nuclear rocket fires. But for God's sakes, when you're dropping 1,000+ pounds of kilos of explosives on the target, you get a pretty damn big boom coming out of that. And anything in that area goes boom with it. So the fact that Russia can cover those areas from Kaliningrad would mean that NATO would have to take Kaliningrad Oblast and Kaliningrad City, which is a big investment in forces, any which way you look at it. So that's going to tie up quite a bit of NATO's resources. Plus, NATO is going to have to take Transnistria. Transnistria, that area is, you can't move up from the south, from Romania and Moldova toward Odessa without taking Transnistria. Simple as that. Now there's about, it's got a population of about 400,000 people, 2/3 of whom are Russian citizens, and all the men are basically military or veterans. So they've got a call up of about 100,000 troops. They also have a gigantic warehousing section for heavy artillery and other munitions. I mean, it's a gigantic munition dump. That was a strategic dump for any future war with NATO in the southern section of Europe, from the Cold War days. And that would actually feed the Ukrainian army for quite a while. Of course, nobody's going to let them take it. And even if they somehow grab it and it's still intact, there's going to be a hypersonic that's going to set it off. And the boom there is going to be so loud, they'll probably hear it in Rome, just to understand. That's going to be an earthquake level event, that much munitions going off. So either way, though, they're going to have to go through that to be able to activate any kind of real front. From the Russian side, it'll be full mobilization, more likely, or partial mobilization, something close to full. So you're going to be pulling in millions of men into arms. It's going to be a war. I mean, if that's how it rolls, it's going to be a full-scale war. Whether NATO's population is ready for that or not, that becomes irrelevant. Now you got to understand, once things go, NATO infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, is going to go. I mean, imagine a hypersonic missile going into those giant gas storage areas in Germany. The explosion from there alone is going to shake Berlin to its core. And then when winter comes, there ain't going to be any gas anywhere, because all those areas are going to be destroyed. That's what a full war is. Russia can very easily reach almost any point in Europe, at least up to and including central France.
Okay, one of our viewers, Astral Beam, is asking, why would NATO escalate and push the world this far?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, and they don't have to make logical sense per se. You've got a proxy war. That's obvious enough, even if there are NATO troops already in this proxy war, but it's still a proxy war. Now, this proxy war is lost. I mean, it's obvious. It's all over but the dying. There's still going to be a lot of dying left, but the war is lost. I mean, there's no way Ukraine, as it stands right now, if it gets $150 billion from America, is going to win this. Because guess what? If you don't have the rounds, it doesn't matter how much they cost. You can't buy them. There are no rounds. So if you consider that, there's only one of two choices left for NATO leadership. Walk away and admit you lost, and then explain to your population why you sacrificed their future, deindustrialized yourself, lost X amount of your own soldiers, betted everything on this, and lost. Or you escalate, you double down. Now, if you've ever been to Vegas, you see people who lost everything. They've gambled away their college tuition fund, their kids' college tuition fund, their house, their wife's ring. You know, they're calling up their mom to get a couple more $1,000 just to get one more stake down, because if they win everything back. I mean, that's kind of the people we're having to dealing with here. They put themselves in a corner. They don't have a lot of choice at all. They don't have a lot of choice. And they're going to have to figure something out, because if they walk away, they've got to explain the last 2 years the economic recessions in all of Europe that are bordering on depression with no way out, or they go for or they put up the stakes higher and maybe win everything. And when you're dealing with narcissistic personalities, That's what you're dealing with. And if you look at it, we're dealing with lots of weak leaders, and weak leaders are the most threatening because they're illogical, because they have to try and show strength, and to try to show strength, they will take risks that a strong leader doesn't need to take. A strong leader is predictable, and predictability is good, because if I'm predictable and you're predictable, we all know how far we can push it before things go bad. We're not going to go that way. We're not going to go badly walking into a minefield, because we know the minefield is there. We'll back off and we'll discuss things. Okay, we've gone far enough. Now let's discuss. Weak leaders, especially weak leaders that are facing internal revolts, or whether it's an actual physical revolt or it's a political revolt inside their parliaments, they're going to have to show strength one way or the other. Macron is a perfect example of that. And not to mention, Macron's also very owned by the bankers that are backing him. In this case, the Rothschilds, since he is a Rothschild man. So you don't get the rational logic, you get the irrational emotional high stakes.
All right. I think that's pretty good analysis. I would agree with that. Let me ask you this. It's pretty clear in the last few weeks, to me anyway, that the United States, the puppet master, well, he's not the puppet master. He's the puppet being mastered by these unseen forces, have been sending out messages that their future funding of Ukraine has changed. Congress will not approve more money. You have the president and you have the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, all of them starting to say, we have to pivot back to Asia, China. China's the real enemy. What is the message, Stas, in your opinion, to Zelensky and Ukraine? Is the United States using this as an excuse to find an off-ramp in Ukraine by saying, oh, we have to pivot again, just like Obama did, to pivot to Asia, because China's the enemy. What do you think this means in terms of an excuse and a way out for the United States, and at the same time leaving NATO and the EU out to dry?
Well, we know one thing about the United States and the way it does things. Whenever a project gets old, boring, and very unprofitable, they just leave. And in this case, the United States is dropping that responsibility on the Europeans, who are in the worst financial and industrial position they've ever been in. Germany is collapsing economically. And not only Germany. I mean, Finland is in its second recession in 2 years. And the intermediate period was only 2 quarters. And now they're going into their fourth quarter of the second recession, just as an example. Welcome to NATO. Enjoy your second world falling to third world status from one of the richest countries in Europe. Everything has a cost. And Europe overall is in the same position. So either they get the Russian resources one way or the other, or they're screwed. I mean, they are screwed. There's no back paddling out of this one. They've gone too far, too fast. And the people that got it there are still in power and may stay in power. Now, Macron is coming to do an address to the nation. Now, when they say, Macron has decided this and everybody in French politics, no, that's not true. There's quite a few hawks in French politics that are still backing Macron and actually calling for even more hostility. Schulz, the people that are more likely to replace Schulz at this point are even more hawkish, much more hawkish than he is. And they're breaking his will now that it's all that great and strong resistance. But one way or the other, like for example, with the Taurus missiles, we'll just give those missiles to the British, and then the British and their experts can go take those missiles to Ukraine. So it won't be Germans manning those missiles. It'll be British manning those missiles. See, we're not really part of this war. Idiotic schemes like that. And Europe is full of these types of people. Plus, Eastern Europe, with the exception of Hungary and now Slovakia, is chock full to the brim with extreme Russophobes. Extreme Russophobes. I mean, foaming at the mouth. They despise everything that is Russian. To the last Russian kid, Russophobes. The Czechs are great. They still remember the uprising in 1967. And that's their beaten call. We're going to get revenge for 1967. They don't remember that the Red Army saved them from a massacre at the hands of the SS in 1945, when Prague was being literally wiped out. They don't remember that even after that 67 rebellion, the most vicious forces that put down the rebellion weren't Soviet. They were actually Polish and East German. They don't remember that. They just remember we hate Russians. No matter what, we despise and hate Russians. We enjoyed Russian money coming in, but we just hate the Russians. And when you're dealing with people like that are just beyond any level of sanity, and there's the foaming at the mouth, psychotics, you got what you got. And these are the people that Macron is now leaning on. So he's got that coalition, the willing, that's now France. And then, by the way, that the French people are against us, and the French people have been protesting Macron for the last 5 years. Now, if you ever read how many people, never mind the Guinness Book of World Records yearly set on the amount of CS gas dumped on your own population, that's Democracy of France, or so that it's called. I would say that's an autocratic state that's not in touch with its people. The number of people have been killed by the French police or heavily injured, because rubber bullets aren't rubber. That's a misnomer. Rubber bullets are steel core bullets with a plastic lining that, yeah, sure, at 5-6 meters, they'll probably break a rib. At 1 meter or so, they'll go right through your head. So there's been a lot of people killed and a lot of people maimed. And so there are people protesting against going to war. Macron really doesn't give a damn. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And he's now got the backing of the Czechs, the Poles, and pre-Baltic states. And questionably the Romanians and the Moldovans. Well, the Moldovan government. As usual, most of these governments are very separated from their people, but they don't give a damn. The people are going to get roped into it. And once a war is going on, you can shut all your political opponents down real quick. Label them as traitors, put them in jail, throw them at the front, or execute them.
All right. We started out talking about the possibility of nuclear war. You don't think that that's very likely. I personally was, and still am, very afraid that it could happen, if not because some Dr. Strangelove in Washington would push the button, but by a misjudgment, a miscalculation. The United States and NATO, as you mentioned earlier, 90,000 troops along Russian borders, Operation Steadfast Defender. They have hundreds of aircraft, ships, as you mentioned, thousands of tanks and howitzers and self-propelled guns. The chance for a mistake, in my mind, is so slim that it could happen. On the other hand, there's a lot of extremely wealthy interests, among them the Rothschilds that you talked about, see war as a money-making business opportunity. What are your thoughts on why would these people who have been making money on war for hundreds of years, certainly through World War I and World War II, and now this war in Ukraine, proxy or whatever, why would they want to risk blowing up the world when their financial interests are at stake and their power?
Well, in their minds, they're not. That's the whole point. They're not pushing for nuclear war, because nuclear war for them, that really is the end of everything they own. Sure, they may have a bunker and they may even reach that bunker. So what happens when you come out of that bunker 6 months later? Everything's destroyed. So your wealth isn't worth anything. So no, they'll go to some distance and maybe get it going very closely, but they're not going to go to nuclear war because they lose everything. What I would be more afraid of in this case is the United States, because the United States has a very interesting line of authority on nuclear weapons. Now, everybody thinks, oh, it's the president and the Secretary of State, or not the Secretary, I'm sorry, Secretary of Defense that have to be the two that launch the nukes. Because you always have a second person or a third person in line that all three have to agree on. So that one guy doesn't go nuts and decide to start nuclear war. But the interesting thing enough is there's a delegation of authority to launch nuclear war, launch nuclear weapons that goes down the chain of command, up to and including each individual captain of a nuclear submarine or any other nuclear weapons carrying ship. So if they lose connection to Washington for, say, 24 hours or 48 hours, and they don't know whether or not Washington's been struck, they now have the power and authority to launch nuclear weapons as they see fit. So now you got to wonder, what's the sanity rating of every one of your top military commanders? So it really comes down to, I was watching a program, I think they were saying somewhere around 100 people that can actually start a nuclear war off the American side.
Yeah. I just watched again for the second or third time the movie On the Beach. And the commander of that submarine did not launch when he had lost communication. Now, this is a fictitious story, a film, but it has happened in reality more than once. I don't remember who the Russian was who basically saved the world because he had lost communication. He was being encouraged to launch nuclear weapons from a submarine, and he didn't do it. Perhaps you can recall his name. I don't recall it right off the bat right now. But Stas, I want to ask you this. Yeah, I want to ask you this. Do you think there might be very powerful forces of evil, who might also be involved in the desire to instigate a nuclear war? Their interests are not about money or power. Their interest would be to eliminate the human race. Is this too much of a stretch?
Well, if you're talking Satanism, Satanism is pretty rife in the West, but I don't think it's going for nuclear war either. By the way, take a look at how many children disappear in America. Now, just for an example, in Russia, it's about 35,000 children disappear every year. Russia has a population of around 150 million, plus minus, more plus these days. And that's a catastrophe. Now, some of those children are stolen by parents after divorces. Some run away, but a very large chunk of those 30,000 children just disappear. Killed, murdered, organs, whatever. That's Russia. America has twice the population. It's almost 800,000 this last year. Let that number sink in. 800,000. And does the federal government really give a damn? Not particularly. You don't hear anything about it. This big epidemic. I mean, it's been growing. 10 years ago it was around 500,000, and it's been growing. So it hasn't been getting stopped. So the question now becomes why. So when you go back to Satanism, yeah, I'd say there's quite a bit of that mess going on. And just look at American Hollywood stars and the theater, or not the theater, the theater of the absurd that they show on their stages. A lot of it's just flat out satanic rituals and so on. So nobody hides it anymore. It's out in the open because they feel so empowered. The culture war and the Christians in America are fighting. Ladies and gentlemen, you lost that war about 20, 30 years ago. And if you think you're still fighting it, you're kidding yourself. You're just surviving at this point. So yeah, there's a lot of evil. I mean, there's a lot of plain evil. There's been over 15, 20,000 children that have gone missing from the Ukrainian side. There's child organ rings. There are child abuse rings. There was a children's home for orphan children that was evacuated in western Lugansk by the Ukrainians as the Russian army was moving forward. Now, the last anyone knows, these children were either, I don't remember, they evacuated either to France or to Germany. And then they were all lost because the record goes to where they were at, and then they were issued new documents and they all disappeared. Who took them, who adopted them, who took them for organs, who the hell knows? But the black market, the organ market, I know it's hard for most people to believe, but it's quite real, very, very real. There's enough documented proof on a lot of these areas that have been evacuated and not everything was destroyed. And it's out there. And again, U.S. as far as Satanism, no, the Anglo-Saxon elites have been on this little satanic thing for the last 300-400 years. That's nothing particularly new. 800,000 children went missing last year in the U.S. That's insane. So, yeah, there's plenty of evil. I don't think it's going for let's wipe out humanity, because that kind of destroys its ability to recruit and grow. But it's growing in Western society. Western society degenerated into basically a subhuman entity. I mean, where you can take 5-6-year-olds and start chopping them up, making boys out of girls, girls out of boys. I mean, basically destroying these children's lives forever. I mean, I'll quote Bill Maher, who's now a centrist. Not that he's ever changed. I mean, Bill Maher, the liberal, is now really a centrist because the liberals and the left has gone so far away from any sanity. And he said, you know, when I was 6 years old, I wanted to be a pirate. Well, thank God nobody decided to gouge out my eye and send me to leg amputation surgery. I mean, it's that level of absurdity that, you know, if a boy says he wants to be a girl, he's 5-6 years old. What the hell? I mean, and now you can go start chopping them up. So, yes, evil in the West is ripe. It is incredibly ripe.
Well, I have felt for a long time there are evil forces, whether they arise from some kind of a deficit in our human nature or from somewhere else. But I don't think there's another word to describe the events that have been happening and escalating towards the possible destruction of life on the planet. The only way to describe that is evil, in my opinion. Now, Stas, I want to transition. Tomorrow, Friday, begins the first of 3 days of a Russian presidential election. I have some American friends who have been selected as official observers.
Oh, cool.
I met some young people this week, and I'm not going to mention what countries they're from, but they're from many different countries around the world that a lot of people may have not heard of, who have been selected as observers. They're going to go to many different regions of Russia to observe the election process. Stas, most American people, and certainly the media, have characterized Vladimir Putin as a dictator, an autocrat, and that there's no such thing as a free election in Russia. You're Russian-born, educated in America, served in the United States military in a tank commander operation, back in Russia now for 10 years. You're a patriotic Russian. What are your thoughts on Putin? Is he an autocrat? Are these elections that are taking place beginning tomorrow? And by the way, this is the 10th anniversary of the Crimean referendum. What are your thoughts on Putin and this election?
Well, he is a strong leader. He had I'm sure he has autocratic tendencies. But then so did Charles de Gaulle, and so did a lot of other leaders. That doesn't make him a dictator. Those are two very different things. He also has 83% popularity rating. Draw your opinions off that. The West is always looking for the great challenge to Putin, whether it was Navalny or Nadezhda or whomever. Yeah, most of these guys are pulling 1-2% of the popularity rating, and they come in second, and they would go, "Oh, he was the second in the and the election was stolen from him." That there was 80-1, literally. Nobody's going to tell you that. I mean, let's look at fair and just elections in the U.S. Yeah, and the next joke is fair and free elections in Germany. Yeah, right, where they're trying to ban the second biggest party, or maybe Macron, the dictator of France. I mean, Germany, by the way, if the media takes a line that is against the government's position on Russia, on media, I won't say media, reporters, that's 3 years in prison. And as soon as charges are leveled, all your bank accounts, everything are frozen. You can't even survive to the court date. I mean, and that's a democracy, or so they call it. If you look at any of these countries, Czechoslovakia, or Czech, I'm sorry, is up to 5 years in prison for criticizing NATO. I mean, you don't have to be pro-Russian. You say, "Hey, NATO is a waste of money. They wrote my cat over while they were maneuvering by." That's up to 5 years. So, and all these are somehow democracies. So the term democracy is as worthless as the term Nazi and everything else. It just gets bantered around to the point that it loses any kind of actual logical concept of what the word means. And democracy, by the way, America is not a democracy. When I enlisted, and I got up to major's rank. I refused the major's rank. I was captain promotable. I left right before I come in a major. When I enlisted, when I actually came in, I was private. I was given a common task manual, about that thick book. That's about that big, and it's got it's about that thick. It's got all your common tasks or all your basic concepts that you have to know how to do, from check writing, to polishing your boots, to parade marching, and on and on and on. And when I came in, and this is 1993, on the first page was a paragraph that said, basically said, the United States is not a democracy. The United States is a representative republic. And I went on with more information. They removed that. It no longer exists in those books. Democracy is mob rule, and the mob rule is ruled by an elite that controls that mob. The fathers of the American Republic despised democracy. Thomas Jefferson quite correctly said democracy is a 51% of taking away the power of the rights of the 49. Also said, there's the only thing more bloody about democracy's rule is its eventual end. So democracy, if the West describes itself, great fun. Yeah, you'll all have fun because it's a mob rule, and the mob always has a brain that's directing that mob, usually the elites. So having said that, Russia has obvious elections. There's tens of thousands of monitors, international monitors. The U.S. has how many international monitors? Yeah, and they're not even allowed to go in. They can only, the few monitors, international monitors for elections that come into the U.S. can only stand outside the building. They're not allowed in. And if you can't make the cutoff time, like it happened to me a couple times, because it's always a work day, basically, oh well, you don't get to vote. Disenfranchisement. And why is it November 9th? It's always in November because the weather is crap in the U.S. in November. So unless you're a fanatic of the Republican or the Democrat Party, chances are, if you're one of those independents who may vote one way or the other, or God forbid, some third party candidate, you're probably not going to show up. So everything's done to make sure that the turnout is less and less. In Russia, everything's done to make sure the turnout is more and more. There are advertisements everywhere. Go vote. They're not telling you who to vote for, but go vote. Now, are there strong candidates running against Putin? No, they're not. And there's no logic in running, because there are no strong enough candidates to run against Putin. Putin, again, it's got an 83% popularity rate. So you're not going to find a candidate strong enough to run against them. They're running. There's 4 candidates in total. They're not going to. They'll pull maybe 10% of the vote. But that's what happens. I mean, when Charles de Gaulle was being elected, there were no candidates that could actually threaten his election until the U.S. Created a color revolution. That is, after Charles de Gaulle said, "Give me my gold. Here's your paper," and it had to be removed. So, that's the reality of it. So yeah, there are elections. There are fair elections, and they're monitored elections. Lots of international monitors. But again, when you have a candidate that has 83% popularity rating, and that's down from 87, so when you have a candidate that strong, I mean, it's obvious who's going to win.
Let me ask you this, Stas. Putin first came into power in the year 2000. He's been president except for 4 years when he was prime minister, but still very powerful person. But we're looking at now 24 years he has been in power. Why is he so popular? 80-some%. Why?
I'll correct you a little bit. 1999, when Yeltsin resigned. Well, because, I mean, look at Russia. Look at Russia in 1999 and look at Russia now. And by the way, as prime minister in 1999, he won the Second Chechen War, where the Chechen Mujahideen, which is mostly Arab, actually, invaded Dagestan to expand the caliphate. And they were crushed, and they were pushed back, and they were cleared out of Chechnya as a whole. I mean, look at Russia now. Moscow was a hole in 1999. You couldn't walk down the streets. Everything was lined up with little carts or whatever, selling everything. Parking was atrocious. You had three layers of parking everywhere. Trash, crime. I mean, it was just horrid. You look at now Moscow now, it's better than any other Western city in the world. It just is. I mean, there's no denying it. And it's not just Moscow. It's every Russian city. There are very few Russian cities that aren't prospering. They're prospering at different rates, true. Some cities are more isolated or economically poor, but the investments are going everywhere. Industry is back. Russia had almost no gold reserves. It's 5th largest. Actually, I'm pretty sure if the U.S. gold reserve was actually counted, last time was 1965, I believe, or 1956. Got to look that up. Inventoried, actually physically inventoried. U.S. would probably be down there about 6th or 7th place. Because I doubt there's that much gold left at Fort Knox. But Russia's 5th largest gold reserves. It's the largest economy in Europe by purchasing power parity, which is how economists actually count economies, and growing. It was prepared for the sanctions. I mean, there's the question would be, why wouldn't he be popular? If anybody rationally looks at Russia, why wouldn't he be popular?
I have asked many Russians about Putin, whether he's a dictator or an autocrat, and I have only met a handful that do not like Putin, do not like his policies, but these people have been more Western-leaning, capitalist-oriented, not patriotic Russians. And I once heard a foreign economist who had spent 20 years of his life in Russia compiling data about all levels of Russian society, economy to the birth rate. When he was asked by a group of people that I was with, and I was documenting this. How is it that Putin can stay in power? And this is what he said, and I want to know if you agree with this. He said that there were powerful forces on one side who were liberal, Western-leaning capitalists who did not represent Russia's best interest. On the other side were equally powerful oligarchs and companies that were patriotic Russians, conservative, traditional Russians, who wanted to keep Russia separate and different from the liberal ideology. And this economist said, Putin has had to be an outstanding manager and politician to balance both of these powerful forces who control money, billions and billions and billions of rubles. It's like in America or anywhere else. Corporations are powerful people because of the money they control. And this is what he said. He said, if Putin ever loses the support of the people of Russia, he's finished. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'd say that for most leaders, if they lose the support of the people, except maybe Macron. I disagree with one thing you're saying, capitalist. Russia's a capitalist system. Well, it's a mixed system. Every country is a mixed system, including the United States. There's a very mixed system between socialism and capitalism. You can't have a purely capitalist system. You can't have a purely socialist system. Neither one works. There's different levels of mix. And I'd say many European countries are much more so socialist than Russia is. Having said that, if you mean global finance leaning, then yes, liberal factions are very globalist finance leaning people. The SVO, the Special Military Operation, Специальная военная операция, has helped consolidate a lot of power away from the liberals. The people who are supposed to cause the revolution in Russia, a lot of them ran away. On the ones that are left, they've basically lost any influence and power. So their capability of trying to start a revolution are pretty much so zilch. What the West was counting on. Like I said, the companies, the corporations, oligarchs, and the people, because the people's livelihood is improving, are backing the leadership. I know a lot of people who didn't like Putin, but are now praying for him. Because the reality of it is they woke up one day and saw to their horror that we really are in an existential war with the West. Where it's not an existential crisis for the West, but it is for us. If we lose, we're no longer going to exist. And the West has made that very plain and simple. They'll chop up Russia into however many pieces, whatever fantasy cartographer is creating this day. Anything from 10 to 40 different entities, depending on who you ask. So, and nobody wants that, obviously. So it's a fight to the end. So the support for even people who didn't support Putin is now full, and they're sitting there they're in church putting candles up and praying for his health, because they understand that without that strong leadership, we're done. So you need that strong leadership, because we are literally fighting the West. Maybe not the Western population as a whole, though a very large chunk of the Western population salivating at the thought of Russia being destroyed. Fortunately, but that is the truth. But the vast, vast, vast majority of the Western elite, they want Russia out of the way, and they want Russian resources for free. And by vast, I would probably say 85% of the Western elite is Russophobic to one degree, or to one extreme, or to the very other extreme, which is slavering at the mouth Russophobic. Those Newlands, those Boltons, and others of that kind. A lot of masks came off. 2 years ago, a lot of masks came off. And a lot of people in Russia had liberal tendencies or leanings that weren't full-scale liberals. They got a shock. You know, I told people for 12 years until all this went that this was coming, and this is why they're coming. This is the reality in the West, as they see Russians. And a lot of people, you know, the things I heard flying my way, I'm not going to go list all that down. Nobody wanted to believe it. It's all you're full of crap, or you've been you've had your feelings hurt there. or this or that. It's like, no. But now they've got that hammer blow to the forehead, and reality is something they can't run away from because it's there, it's in their face, and it's the West words, cancel culture, Russia. Russians are all evil, etc., etc. And even the liberals are, oh, but we're the good Russians. Smack on the head. Nope, you're still a Russian. Need to die, and your kids too. So and there's a lot of people like that. A lot of foaming at the mouth, rabid, racist Russophones. Quite a few of those are in power.
Stas, I want to thank you so much for this really riveting interview. All of my interviews with you are riveting.
Thank you.
You were raised and educated in America. You're Russian-born, and now you've returned to Russia. You present a very unique perspective in terms of analyzing not only the conflict and the special military operation, but as we discussed tonight, the Russian internal domestic and political situation. I can't thank you enough. And I want to thank our viewers who participated tonight and asked several questions. We really do appreciate it. Stas, we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Same.